7 men had already said no. The word was a small, hard stone dropped into the thick air of the Providence saloon, sinking through the haze of cheap whiskey and wood smoke. Lynn stood beside the mercantile owner, Mr. Davies, a man whose smile was as thin as his waistcoat was fine. She kept her eyes fixed on a knot in the floorboards, a dark swirl like a frozen eddy in a river. Each refusal was the same. A man would swagger forward, look her over as he would a horse, his gaze lingering on the strange silk of her pink cheongsam, the unfamiliar lines of her face, the dark braid that fell to her waist. He would see a doll, a curiosity, something fragile and foreign. Then he would see her eyes, and in them, a stillness he did not understand and did not want to. He would shake his head, mutter something to his friends about bad luck or a preference for women with more meat on their bones, and turn back to his drink. The laughter that followed was coarse and low. Mr. Davies's smile tightened with each rejection. He had paid for her passage, a debt she was now meant to repay with a respectable marriage. But Providence, Montana, in the dead of winter, was short on respectability and long on rough opinions. "She's clean," Mr. Davies announced to the room, his voice strained with the cheer of a failing auctioneer. "Hard-working. 18 years old and no family to speak of. An orphan. She'll make a good wife for a man looking to settle." His words painted a picture of compliance and utility, of a life without complication. But the men in the saloon saw only complication. They saw a language they didn't speak, customs they didn't know, and a silence that felt like judgment. The 7th man, a young ranch hand with more bravado than sense, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her slippered feet. "I ain't wedding no China doll," he sneered, and that seemed to be the final word. A murmur of agreement went through the room. The matter was settled. Lynn felt Mr. Davies's hand on her arm, a proprietary grip that was about to steer her back out into the biting cold, to what fate she did not know. She braced herself, her entire world contained in the small, worn bundle of belongings clutched in her other hand. It was all she had. It was always ready. She had learned long ago to be ready to leave. One small act of survival at a time. That was how she had lived since she was a child. It was all she knew. Then the saloon doors swung open with a force that was not the wind. The sudden blast of Arctic air silenced the room, snuffing out the laughter and guttering the lamps. Framed in the doorway stood a man who seemed to have been carved from the mountain itself. He was immense, a head taller than any other man in the room, his shoulders so broad they filled the entire doorframe. A great, untamed beard, frosted with ice, covered the lower half of his face, and his hair was a dark mane tangled by the wind. He wore heavy, patched furs, wolf and bear, and carried the scent of pine, cold stone, and something wild. The men shifted, their bravado evaporating. They knew him. Lachlan. The mountain man. He lived alone, high in the peaks, coming to town only twice a season for supplies, speaking little and tolerating no one. He was considered more a part of the wilderness than of the town, a ruthless hermit with a history no one dared ask about. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, swept the room with disinterest. They passed over the fearful faces, the glasses of whiskey, the card games. Then they landed on Lynn. He did not look at her the way the others had. There was no appraisal, no flicker of contempt or crude desire. He simply looked. It was a long, steady gaze, as if he were watching a hawk on the wind or sighting a lion through a dense forest. He saw the stillness, but he did not mistake it for fragility. He saw the worn silk of her dress, a splash of impossible color in the grimy saloon, and the way her hands, though small, were clasped with a strength that belied their size. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Mr. Davies, sensing an unlikely opportunity, cleared his throat. "Lachlan," he said, his voice regaining some of its oily smoothness. "This is an unusual circumstance." Lachlan's gaze did not move from Lynn. "What's the price?" His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding deep in the earth. Mr. Davies blinked, surprised by the directness. "Well, it's not a sale, it's a marriage. I've sponsored her passage. I seek only to see her settled with a good man. A dowry, you might say, to cover my expenses." He trailed off as Lachlan took a step into the room. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a heavy gold coin, tossing it onto the bar. It landed with a solid, definitive clink that echoed in the silence. "That cover it?" he asked, his eyes still on Lynn. Mr. Davies scrambled to snatch the coin. "Yes, that's more than generous, Lachlan." More than. Lachlan gave a curt nod. He looked at Lynn one last time, a silent question passing between them. He was not offering romance or comfort. He was offering an escape. A different cage, perhaps, but one far from this room of leering faces. She met his gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. "She'll do," Lachlan said to no one in particular. He turned to her. "Get your things." Lynn held up her small bundle. He grunted, turned, and walked back out the door, leaving it open for her to follow. She walked past the stunned faces of the 7 men who had rejected her, past Mr. Davies who was biting the coin to test its authenticity, and stepped out into the crushing cold, following the massive, silent man into the storm. The journey up the mountain was a silent battle against the elements. The wind was a physical force, tearing at Lynn's thin silk dress and stealing the breath from her lungs. Lachlan walked ahead, his huge frame a temporary shield, but the cold was insidious, seeping into her bones. He did not speak, did not look back. He moved with a relentless, ground-eating stride, as sure-footed on the icy trail as a goat. Lynn struggled to keep up, her slippered feet, so unsuited for this terrain, slipping and sliding. The world was a blur of white snow and dark pines. She fell once, her hand sinking into the freezing powder, the shock of it a sharp pain. She pushed herself up without a sound, her resolve a small, hard flame inside her. Complaining was a luxury she had never been afforded. After what felt like hours, they arrived. The cabin was nestled in a stand of ancient pines, its walls made of thick, dark logs chinked tightly against the wind. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a lonely grey banner against the oppressive white of the landscape. It was a fortress, not a home. Inside, the story was the same. It was a place built for survival, not for living. A single, crudely made chair sat before a large stone hearth where a low fire burned. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a stack of furs piled on it. The rest of the single room was filled with the tools of a solitary life, traps, skinning knives, axes, and sacks of provisions stacked against the far wall. There was a layer of dust on everything that was not in daily use. The air was cold, despite the fire, and held the faint, sad scent of old grief. Lachlan gestured with his head toward a corner near the hearth. "There," he grunted. It was not an invitation, but a designation of space. He dropped a heavy bearskin on the floor for her. A bed. He then turned to the fire, stoking it with a log, his back to her a solid wall of dismissal. Lynn went to her assigned corner and set down her bundle. From the shadows under the cot, a low growl rumbled. A pair of yellow eyes gleamed. A great, half-wild dog, more wolf than canine, rose to its feet, the fur on its neck bristling. It was as gaunt and savage-looking as its master. Lachlan glanced at the animal. "Fen." Down the dog sank back into the shadows, but its growl continued, a low thrum of mistrust. Lynn understood the sentiment. She was an intruder in this silent, wounded place. Lachlan paid her no more mind. He took a hunk of dried meat from a hook and began to eat, standing by the fire. He did not offer her any. She had not expected him to. She was a bargain struck in a saloon, a piece of a transaction. Food, warmth, kindness, those were not part of the deal. She sat on the bearskin, her back straight, and watched the fire, gathering the meager warmth to herself. The house had a ghost. She could feel it in the crushing emptiness, in the single chair, in the way the man moved as if there were a space beside him he was careful not to touch. This was his wound, and she had just walked into the middle of it. In the days that followed, a quiet routine began to form, unspoken and unnegotiated. Lachlan would rise before dawn, his movements stirring the cold air, and leave to check his trap lines. He would be gone for most of the day, leaving Lynn alone in the silent cabin with the growling dog for a companion. She did not wait for instructions. Usefulness was her currency, the only one she had ever possessed. She began to put the house in order, one small thing at a time. She found a worn broom and swept the floor, the dust of months or years rising in clouds. She gathered the scattered tools and arranged them neatly against the wall. She found a stash of Lachlan's mending supplies, thick needles and sinew thread, and began to repair his torn furs, her stitches small and even, a line of delicate care on the brutal hides. She discovered his larder was a chaotic mess of sacks and crates. With methodical patience, she organized it. She found a half-empty sack of weevil-infested flour, which she painstakingly sifted, saving what she could. She found dried beans, salted pork, and a small tin of precious tea leaves, long forgotten. Each day, she would have a fire roaring when Lachlan returned, the cabin a little warmer, a little cleaner, a little more orderly than he had left it. She would take the small portion of food he left for her without comment and eat it in her corner, her silence mirroring his. He never acknowledged her work. He would enter, shake the snow from his furs, and his gaze would sweep the room. He would notice the neatly folded pelts, the clean-swept hearth, the scent of pine boughs she had laid to combat the dust. He would notice, but he would not speak. His silence was a fortress, and she did not try to breach it. She simply continued her quiet work, making a space for herself in the cracks of his solitude. She washed his few dishes, heated water for him to wash, and retreated to her corner, making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. It was a strange, silent dance of cohabitation. Two lonely people living around the shape of a profound absence, the space between them filled with the howling of the wind and the things they did not say. The dog, Fen, was Lachlan's shadow, a creature as walled-off and mistrustful as the man himself. For the first week, he regarded Lynn as an unwelcome presence, a disruption to the grim order of his world. He would lie in the shadows, his yellow eyes tracking her every move, a low growl a constant undercurrent in the quiet cabin. If she came too near the hearth, he would lift his head, his lip curling to show a flash of white teeth. He was a sentinel, guarding his master's solitude. Lynn did not try to win him over. She knew better than to force herself on a wounded animal. Instead, she extended a quiet, patient courtesy. When she ate her small portion of food, she would leave a tiny scrap, placing it on the floor a safe distance from him. At first, he ignored it, letting it lie until Lachlan cleared it away. Then, one evening, after Lachlan was asleep on his cot, Lynn saw the dog creep forward, snatch the offered piece of jerky, and retreat back into the darkness to devour it. It was a beginning. She started speaking to him, not in English, but in the soft, tonal language of her homeland. She did not coo or cajole. She just spoke, her voice low and melodic, telling him simple things as she mended a shirt or stirred a pot of bean soup. She told him about the sparrows in the eaves of the orphanage, about the scent of rain on hot city stones. He would watch her, his head cocked, the growl in his chest slowly quieting. The turning point came during a particularly cold night. The fire had burned low, and a bitter draught snaked through a gap in the floorboards. Lynn shivered on her bearskin, pulling her thin cheongsam tighter around her. Fen, who usually slept at the foot of Lachlan's cot, rose and padded silently across the floor. He did not go to the cot. He came to her corner, circled twice, and then lay down on the floor beside her bearskin, his body a solid barrier against the draft, his fur radiating a surprising warmth. He sighed, a great puff of air, and rested his heavy head on his paws. Lynn held her breath. Slowly, she reached out a hand, not to touch him, but simply to let it rest in the space near his head. He did not flinch. He did not growl. He just lay there, a silent offering of truce, and of warmth. When Lachlan woke the next morning, he saw the dog beside her. He stood there for a long moment, his face unreadable in the pre-dawn gloom. He looked at the wild creature he had raised from a pup, a dog that tolerated no one but him, now sleeping peacefully beside this small, foreign woman. He saw the trust, freely given. He said nothing. He simply turned, pulled on his boots, and went out into the snow, but something in his rigid posture had shifted. The fortress had a new crack in its wall. Lachlan began to answer her silent acts of care with his own. He was a man who spoke with his hands, with the things he could build or fix. One afternoon, he returned from the woods not with game, but with a length of cured pine. He spent the evening by the fire, not cleaning his rifle or sharpening his knives, but working the wood. With a small knife and a piece of sandstone, he carved and smoothed it, his large, rough hand surprisingly gentle. The next morning, a small, three-legged stool stood in her corner. It was simple, sturdy, and sanded so smooth it felt like silk beneath her fingers. He never mentioned it. It was just there, a solid, tangible piece of gratitude. A few days later, a second cup, whittled from birchwood, appeared on the rough-hewn mantel. He began to leave larger portions of food for her, a thicker slice of roasted venison, an extra potato. He still did not speak, but the gestures were a language she understood perfectly. It was a conversation held in objects, in silent provisions. One day, Mr. Davies made the arduous trip up the mountain, his horse struggling in the deep snow. He claimed it was a courtesy visit, a trip to deliver supplies Lachlan had ordered. His smile was as practiced as ever, but his eyes darted around the now orderly cabin, taking in the changes. He saw the mended furs, the clean floor, and Lynn, who stood quietly by the hearth. "Well now," Davies said, his voice oozing false concern. "Looks like you're managing." "I was worried this wilderness might be too much for the girl," Lachlan just grunted, taking the sacks of flour and salt. "Leave the bill." Davies placed a slip of paper on the table, his gaze lingering on Lynn. "If it's not working out, Lachlan, you just send word. I can find another arrangement for her." A respectable one. In town the implication was clear. This was not respectable. Lachlan's jaw tightened. "Get out, Davies." After the man left, Lynn began to put the supplies away. She lifted the sack of flour. It felt light. Lighter than the last one she had organized. She looked at the bill Davies had left, at the high price listed for the flour and the tin of coffee. She then remembered seeing an old, leather-bound ledger under a loose floorboard when she was cleaning. A suspicion, small and sharp, pricked at her. Later that night, when Lachlan was outside, she retrieved the old ledger. It was filled with his rough script, detailing prices from years past. She compared them to the prices on Davies's recent bill. The flour was double the price. The salt, triple. It was all there, a quiet story of sustained theft, of a man taking advantage of another's isolation. She put the ledger back, her heart pounding. The wrongness she had sensed in the saloon was not just about the men's cruelty. It was about Mr. Davies himself. He was not a benefactor. He was a predator. And she was another one of his assets. The first flakes began to fall just after dusk, soft and innocuous. By midnight, it was a blizzard. The wind shrieked like a banshee, hurling snow against the cabin with such force the log walls shuddered. It was a whiteout, a raging sea of snow that erased the world, isolating them completely. Lachlan had been out late, securing the animal shelters and bringing in a last load of firewood. He came in coated in ice, his beard a solid mass of white. "Storm's a bad one," he muttered, the most he'd said in a week. "Could be here for days." He seemed unconcerned, a man accustomed to weathering the furies of the mountain. The next day, he insisted on checking a line of traps close to the cabin, worried an animal might be caught and suffering. He wrapped himself in his heaviest furs and disappeared into the swirling vortex of white. Lynn watched him go, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The wind howled, and the hours stretched on. When he finally stumbled back through the door, he was no longer the invincible mountain man. He was pale, and a dark stain was spreading across the furs on his left leg. He collapsed onto the floor just inside the door, dragging a drift of snow in with him. "Branch fell," he gasped, his teeth chattering. Legs cut deep. Lynn rushed to his side. With trembling fingers, she helped him pull away the heavy, blood-soaked furs. A long, gaping wound ran down his thigh, ragged and deep, bleeding sluggishly. He was already growing faint from the cold and blood loss. The town, the doctor, they were an impossible distance away. They were utterly alone, trapped by the storm. In that moment, she was not the frightened orphan, the bartered bride. She was the only thing standing between this man and death. All her life, she had survived by being useful. Now, his survival depended on it. She took a deep breath, the cold air steadying her, and went to work. She moved with a calm efficiency that surprised even herself. First, she stoked the fire until it was a roaring blaze, fighting back the cabin's deep chill. She dragged the heavy bearskin from her corner and managed to roll Lachlan onto it, getting him closer to the warmth. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy. Fever was setting in. From her small, precious bundle, she took out a packet of dried herbs and a clean strip of linen, things she had kept with her always, remnants of a past where she had learned to be her own physician. She had also, during her quiet explorations of the woods near the cabin, been gathering things: yarrow to stop bleeding, willow bark for fever, and moss with antiseptic properties. She had prepared for a winter she did not know, an instinct honed by a lifetime of uncertainty. She boiled water and cleaned the wound as gently as she could, Lachlan groaning, his body tense with pain. She packed it with the crushed yarrow and moss, then bound it tightly with the linen, reinforcing it with strips torn from one of her own undergarments. She brewed a bitter tea from the willow bark and coaxed him to drink it, lifting his heavy head. For 3 days and nights, the storm raged outside, and a different storm raged inside the cabin. Lachlan's fever climbed. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in his delirium. In those fever-soaked hours, the ghost in the house was given a name. Sarah, he would murmur, his hand reaching for something that wasn't there. The snow. I told you not to go out, Sarah, and later, Daniel, my boy. The words were fragments of a tragedy, pieces of the wound he carried so silently. Lynn sat by his side, wiping his brow with cool cloths, forcing sips of broth and tea between his lips, and keeping the fire alive. She understood now. The single chair, the empty space, the impenetrable grief. He had lost them here, in this wilderness, likely to a storm just like this one. She was no longer just tending to a physical wound. She was sitting vigil over a shattered heart. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear for the first time. He was weak, but the delirium was gone. He looked at the clean, tight bandage on his leg, at the empty bowl of broth beside him, at her, her face pale with exhaustion. He watched her for a long time. How, he finally whispered, his voice raspy. Where did you learn? She looked at her hands, resting in her lap. When you have no one, she said softly, her own voice hoarse from lack of use. You learn to be the one who knows how. To mend, to heal, to be of use. Or you do not survive. He held her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw the walls of his fortress, breached and broken by the storm, finally begin to crumble. When the blizzard finally ceased, it left behind a world transformed, draped in a blanket of pristine, suffocating silence. The snow was piled in monstrous drifts against the cabin, and the sun on the landscape was blinding. It was another week before the trail down to Providence was even remotely passable. Lachlan was still weak, confined to his cot, but the wound was clean and beginning to heal. The quiet between them had changed. It was no longer a silence of distance, but one of shared experience, a fragile intimacy forged in the heart of the storm. It was into this new silence that Mr. Davies arrived, his face a mask of practiced concern. He had clearly fought his way up the trail, a testament to his determination. Lachlan! Thank heavens, he boomed, stamping snow from his boots. The whole town was worried. When the storm hit, I said to myself, I pray for that man and his little bride. His eye scanned the room, landing on Lachlan in the cot, and a flicker of something calculating crossed his face. He saw weakness. An opportunity. He turned to Lynn. Child, you must be terrified. This is no place for a delicate thing like you. It's time I took you back to town. I'll find you a proper home, with a family. A woman's touch is needed. He spoke as if Lachlan wasn't there, his tone proprietary, as if he were reclaiming misplaced property. She stays, Lachlan said, his voice quiet but firm from the cot. Davies waved a dismissive hand. Don't be foolish, man. You can't care for her, and you certainly can't in your state. It's my responsibility. While Davies postured, Lynn moved with quiet purpose. Her mind was clear. The light sack of flour. The exorbitant bill. The old ledger. The man's predatory concern, it all connected. She walked to the loose floorboard she had discovered weeks ago, pried it up, and retrieved Lachlan's old ledger. She then walked to the mantel and picked up the bill Davies had left on his last visit. Her hands did not shake. Her heart was calm. She had the truth, and for the first time in her life, she felt the power of it. She was not just a survivor, tossed by the whims of others. She was a witness. Mr. Davies put a hand on Lynn's arm. Come now, girl. Pack your things. His grip was firm, insistent. I said, she stays, Lachlan repeated, pushing himself up on one elbow, his face pale but his eyes burning with a cold fire. Davies ignored him. She doesn't belong here. This is a matter of Christian duty. Let go of my arm, Mr. Davies, Lynn said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room with the clarity of a ringing bell. Davies, startled by her tone, loosened his grip. She walked to the small table in the center of the room and laid the old, leather-bound ledger open. Beside it, she placed the bill from his last delivery. Your Christian duty seems to involve charging a man who lives in isolation double the price for flour and triple for salt, she stated, her finger tracing the column of figures in Lachlan's old book, then pointing to the inflated numbers on the bill. You have been robbing him for years. Davies's face went from ruddy to pale. He stared at the evidence, laid out so plainly. That's preposterous. A misunderstanding of market fluctuations. The price of flour in Providence has not doubled since last fall, Mr. Davies, Lynn continued, her voice steady. Nor has the price of salt. I asked another trapper who was in your store the day I arrived. He told me what he pays. It was a lie, a calculated bluff, but it landed with the force of truth. Davies was speechless. He had underestimated her completely. He had seen a silent, compliant doll, not a woman with a keen eye and a memory for injustice. He looked from her unshakable face to the cold fury in Lachlan's eyes and knew he was defeated. At that moment, Lachlan swung his legs off the cot. He stood, leaning heavily on the wall, but he was on his feet. He walked the few steps to the table and stood beside Lynn. He did not touch her, but his presence was a declaration. He was an immense, immovable wall of support at her back. He looked down at the cowering merchant. Get out of my house, Lachlan said, his voice a low growl of finality. And you are never to come up this mountain again. Davies stumbled backward, grabbing his hat. Without another word, he fled, scrambling out the door and into the snow, a man utterly undone not by violence, but by quiet truth. The cabin was silent again. The confrontation was over. The air was clear. Lynn stood by the table, her hands resting on the open ledger. She had done it. She had fought back, not with her hands, but with her mind. She had protected this house. She had protected him. She looked up at Lachlan. He was looking at her, his expression one she had never seen before. It was a mixture of awe, gratitude, and something deeper, something warmer. He took a step toward her, then stopped. His gaze went to her corner, to the small, familiar bundle of her belongings that had sat there since the day she arrived. It was her escape plan, her readiness to leave, a symbol of her entire life. He walked over to it, his limp pronounced. He bent down, his large hands surprisingly gentle, and picked up the worn, silk-wrapped bundle. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to hand it to her, that this was his way of saying her purpose was served. Instead, he walked to a large wooden chest in the corner, a chest she had never seen him open. He lifted the heavy lid, placed her bundle carefully inside among neatly folded blankets that smelled of cedar, and closed it. The sound of the lid clicking shut was the loudest thing she had ever heard. He turned back to her, the space between them no longer an empty chasm. Lynn, he said. It was the first time he had said her name. Just her name. Not as a command or a statement of fact, but as a recognition. As a beginning. She met his gaze, and for the first time since she had left her homeland, she felt the solid ground of belonging beneath her feet. She was home. Thank you for watching.